Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. In my recent video celebrating reaching 14,000 subscribers, I listed 7 Grail games. One game that wasn't strictly part of the list, but which I touched on briefly whilst talking about the Aliens Predator card game, was Middle-earth the Collectible card game, published by Iron Crown Enterprises in 1995. I loved that game, but I was frustrated by it too. I was frustrated because I would have been 16 years old at the time, of limited means, and in love with a game that was collectible. I have, over the years, enjoyed many different collectible games, but I've enjoyed those games despite them being collectible, certainly not because of them being collectible. Now, I do understand the appeal of the collectible format, that thrill of searching for uncommon and rare cards, that excitement when you open a pack and find something cool, or when you negotiate a decent trade with your friends. I have seen my daughter opening Pokemon cards, and the sheer joy and excitement with each new reveal is worth the ticket price. I also understand that Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, both games that have sucked more than their fair share of money out of my wallet over the years, are essential for local stores. Those are the products that keep the lights on and the doors open. So I don't hate the existence of collectible games, those games where you pay money for a sealed pack that could be nothing but bin filler, but they have always been a frustration to me, and that frustration is only magnified when I really enjoy the game. Middle-earth, which has been out of production for many years now, is beautiful. It's detailed, it fully realises Tolkien's world in a way that I think few other games have or could. Almost every major character, faction, location, item and event that you could care to name from Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit was in the initial offering of 484 cards. But actually finding them, owning them, well, there's the rub. I'm going to talk briefly about card distribution here. If that sounds monumentally dull, check the timestamps in the video description to skip ahead. The 484 base cards were divided up into 121 rare cards, 121 uncommon cards, and then the rest were designated as common or fixed. In a booster pack of 15 cards, you would get 1 rare, 3 uncommon, and 11 common. Pretty standard distribution that just emphasises why I don't really like collectible games. I do think it's less of a hardship these days, with online groups for trading and many online sellers offering singles, but back in the day with just me and my mate playing, trying to collect a full set or even just a set that contained enough interesting characters was difficult. And I think that was compounded by how the starter packs were arranged. There were 5 different sets of fixed cards, and 1 was tucked into each starter pack along with 3 random rare cards, 9 random uncommon cards, and 40 random common cards. Each of the fixed card sets contained 2 of the 5 wizards, 5 other characters, 2 factions, some cards that are essential in any deck including all the safe havens, plus 7 sites, including the 2 sites that worked with the included factions. That distribution meant that you could always play the game with just the contents of a single starter, which is great, and you would always get at least 1 decent character. But because fixed cards were only available in starter packs, it also meant you had to buy at least 5 starters to get everything, and there was no way to tell which fixed card set was inside each box. And of course, some of the most desirable characters were only included in the fixed card sets. Aragorn, for example, appeared in just 1 of the 5 fixed starters, so you'd have a 1 in 5 chance of finding him. Conversely, less desirable characters like Annalena and Robin Smallburrow appeared in multiple fixed card sets, so you would invariably end up with multiple copies. Every starter also had essential fixed cards like Havens that you would get again and again to the point where you didn't need them anymore, but you couldn't trade or sell them because nobody else needed them either. With 40 common cards in each starter, you quickly amassed all the commons you needed, with the exception of region cards, which were only in boosters and nobody cared about anyway. So once you started buying the 15 card booster packs, you were really only looking for that 1 rare card in each booster, because you had seen everything else before over and over again. And the rare cards, of course, not only represent the most desirable characters of all, but also the items and events that define the key moments of the books, or which form part of intricate card combos. Frodo, Bilbo, Galadriel, Anduril, the White Tree, the Witch King, Smaug, Fellbeast, Shadowfax, all rare. I think you get the point. And there will be people who argue that the distribution method was fair. As I said, you could play the game with just a single starter, and you were guaranteed some interesting characters. And also, by putting characters like Aragorn and Gimli in the fixed packs, it meant as long as you were buying multiple starters, you probably had a better chance of getting them than if they were designated as rare. My counter is that they still made a lot of the best stuff rare. Who wants to play a Lord of the Rings game when they don't have Frodo in the mix? And they could have easily made the distribution kinder by making a way of telling which set of fixed cards you were getting in a starter. I mean, there are 5 wizards in the game, why not have one starter themed around each one? This is something ICE would later do with the Lidless Eye expansion, when they made one character visible through the packaging so you could choose which set to buy. I guess they learned something. Because spending out on a booster and not getting any new cards is one thing, buying a whole starter deck and finding out it's the set you already have is another. And I think one of the biggest problems with the Middle-earth game using the collectible format is that it's so clever and intricate and layered. It's trying so hard to capture every important moment from the books, so it feels like a game where having every card is important. You want every card because you want to explore Tolkien's world completely, but you need every card because so many of the cards rely on having other cards too. I will talk about this more later in the video, but when the game offers you up the chance to reforge Anduril, but doing so requires a common, an uncommon and a rare card in combination, yeah, frustrating. So, 16-year-old me picked up one of the wizard starter decks. I remember it vividly because the 2 wizards I got in the pack were Saruman and Alatar. Ask anybody which wizard they would want to play in a Lord of the Rings game and see how many people would choose Alatar. Oh, and as an aside, how much cooler would Amazon's Rings of Power have been if they had chosen to make a show about Alatar and Palando running interference behind enemy lines, fleshing out 2 characters that never really got any time in the spotlight. Now that would have been a show, and they would have had all the excuses for creating their own plotlines. Anyway, my starter pack also included Gimli and Bard Bowman, then Bjorn and a couple of minor characters, so it wasn't a bad set. I don't recall if I ever bought any more starters, but I did buy a lot of boosters, and of course I never found most of the important characters. I enjoyed the game immensely, but when Annalena and Orofin are on a quest to find the Lesser Ring to bring down some local trolls, it just doesn't capture the sweeping grandeur and epic scale of Tolkien's book. Which is something this game actually can do. Because I'm not kidding, this game is an incredibly meticulous recreation of the world. Really, it should have been a board game, with everything you need packed into a single box. In fact, as I understand it, there are extensive alternative rule systems that fans now use that convert the game into more of a board game experience. I think the living card game format also would have worked very well, allowing you to start in one region of the world and gradually travel into distant, more dangerous lands. But alas, back in 1995, a collectible card game is what we got, so that is what I'm reviewing here. Not what it could have been, and not what others have made it into. Just the game as it was first presented to me all those years ago. And of course you're wondering, how can I even be reviewing this game? It was in my video about Grail games, I don't even own it. Well, I didn't then. But as I've said before and will say again, I have the best subscribers in the world, because after I posted that video I was contacted by Richie from Dragon Valley Miniatures, which is a new freelance commission painting service. I'll link to the official Instagram page in the video description below. Richie had a collection of Middle-earth cards that he said he would be happy to send on to the channel. Naturally, I accepted, and a few days later a huge selection of cards arrived in the post, far more than I had expected. It was a huge chunk of the premiere release, including a lot of rares that I had never seen, and enough duplicates of all the important cards to be able to create a nice range of decks. Plus, a wedge of cards from various expansions. An absolutely phenomenal gift. However, there was one issue. The Middle-earth card game relies on having 2 decks of cards to play with. You have your main deck, which has your characters and resources, plus hazards to play on your opponent, and then you have your site deck, which contains the locations you intend to travel to throughout your adventure. There are also region cards, which are the different areas of Middle-earth where the sites are located, and which you use to indicate the path you are taking to any site you decide to travel to. And in the massive selection of cards Richie sent, there were no sites and no regions. After looking around on eBay trying to find a convenient way to buy a big chunk of sites, I turned to Board Game Geek, asking if any collectors there would have a set of sites, or at least the most important ones, that I could buy. Step forward our second hero of this epic tale, Board Game Geek user Nick Bolton. Nick contacted me and said he had a big collection of these cards and he would happily send me duplicates that he didn't need. Turns out he lives local to me, so one short drive later and I had a complete set of the region cards and almost all of the site cards. Honestly, the kindness of strangers never ceases to amaze me. Receiving so many cards from 2 people who owed me nothing and don't know me beyond being a voice on the internet, well, that's pretty awesome. I was, of course, still missing some cards I wanted, so I have put my hand in my own pocket to buy some singles. There are still notable gaps in my collection. I still don't have Frodo, Bilbo or Galadriel, and I'm really struggling to put together Rohan decks because I still don't have an Edoras sight card, but I can hardly complain. I have hundreds of cards to work with now. Which leads me to the second challenge this game presents. If the first challenge is collecting cards, the second challenge is knowing what the heck to do with them. Deck building for this game is a real trip. The basic premise of the game is that up to 5 players, each taking on the role of one of the 5 wizards, are travelling Middle-earth, attempting to rally factions to their aid, collect powerful artifacts, and generally assert the most influence in gathering resources to repel the forces of Sauron. Bringing a faction to your banner, storing artifacts, and gathering information all score marshalling points. At a certain point, the Council of the Free People is called, and the wizard who has gained the most points wins this swinging contest. There is a way to win by destroying the One Ring, but in most cases the victor will be the wizard who has done the best job of rousing the Free People to battle Sauron. And this is a narrative-based game. It's steeped in the theme and you go on a little adventure, a quest, to accumulate your marshalling points. It doesn't abstract concepts the way a lot of card games might, and while you are in direct competition with the other players, you are all technically on the same side. The wizards aren't fighting each other. Saruman is loyal in this game. They just disagree on the method of achieving their goals, so the conflict is less confrontational and immediate than in something like Magic the Gathering. Instead, when other players take their turn, you assume the role of Sauron's forces and play hazard cards on them. So, in order to play the game, you first need to decide on how you want to achieve your victory. Which lands will you explore? Which factions will you rally? Are you going to run interference to gather information? Will you directly oppose enemy forces? Are you going to quest for powerful items, or will you throw the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom? Then you build your location deck. This deck should contain copies of the 4 safe haven locations, and then no more than 1 each of any other sight card. You can include every sight card you own, but if you plan on focusing on specific objectives, you may as well just include the sites necessary for those objectives to speed up gameplay. Bear in mind, you will need to travel between the sites you choose, and the farther you travel, the more opportunities there are for your opponent to hit you with hazards, so ideally you want to focus your sights into a small area. Let's take a closer look at a sight card. This is Tolfalas. In the top left corner is the sight type. There are 6 different types, and this symbol means a ruin or lair. The sight type dictates what kinds of hazards you may face there, with ruins being moderately dangerous. The most dangerous locations are designated darkholds, and the safest are havens and freeholds. Below the sight type is a sight path. This represents the types of terrain you must travel through to move between this site and the nearest haven. The nearest haven is specified on the card, and in this case is Etherlond. There are 6 sight path types, ranging from the relatively safe free domains to the dangerous dark domains, and as with sight types, they dictate which types of hazards you may encounter. It should be noted that sight paths on cards are only used in the basic version of the game. If you play with the advanced rules, you use region cards instead. The region cards are kept separate from your play deck and location deck and simply let you plot your own course across the world map, allowing you to avoid certain regions, perhaps taking longer safer routes, or instead going for more direct and dangerous ones. You don't actually need to use these region cards. You can do exactly the same thing using a game map of Middle-earth. There are loads available online. Frankly, region cards are a bit of a faff, and I suspect most people go for the map option instead. It's just another example of how this game would probably have been better served by a board game treatment. Anyway, back to sight cards. Below the image it specifies which region the site is in. Some regions have multiple sites, others don't. Then you get a listing for the nearest haven, and then a list of the types of cards you can play at that site. In this case you can play minor, major and greater items, so if you plan on putting those sorts of items into your play deck, this is a good location to have in your sight deck. However, some sites also have automatic attacks. In this case there are some undead foes. Before you play a card at a site with automatic attacks, you must first face those attacks, unless you have a hobbit in your team, in which case you may be able to pass a burglary test to bypass those attacks. Finally, in the bottom left corner there are 2 numbers. These are the maximum number of cards you and your opponent draw if you move to this location. I told you, this game is densely packed. There are a lot of rules and a lot to think about with every card. But moving on, you next build a play deck of 25 to 50 resource cards and an equal number of hazard cards. Resources comprise items, from lowly healing herbs to the One Ring itself, allies, factions, short events, long events and permanent events. Hazards are creatures, short events, long events or permanent events. There is a huge variety in what these cards are and what they do. It's far too much to go through in a video like this, but we'll take a look at some examples later on. As with any card game, it's a good idea to keep your play deck relatively lean, because it makes it easier to draw out the combos you need, and also because once you have exhausted your play deck once, any sites you have already visited and used become active again, and you have the right to call the free council at the end of any of your turns, giving you a lot of power over when and how the game ends. Next, you pick from 1 to 5 starting characters, but not a wizard. Here's everybody's favourite elf Legolas with a beautiful piece of art by Quinton Hoover. In the top left you have the marshalling points, that's what they are worth to you in the point salad at the end of the game if they are in play. Then you have their mind value in a little head icon. This is like a cost to bring them into play, and also to keep them in play. Throughout the game you have a pool of 20 general influence points for controlling heroes, so when you select your starting characters they are not allowed to have total mind points in excess of 20. However, some characters also have direct influence, which is the value in the hand icon. Once a game is underway, you can organise your heroes in play so that some are directly controlling others. For example, Legolas with his direct influence of 2 could control one character with a mind of 2 or 2 characters with a mind of 1 each. As they are being controlled by Legolas, they do not count towards your general influence of 20, thus freeing up points to bring even more characters into play. Under the image of the character we have their role and race. Legolas is a warrior diplomat elf, so he can use cards that require any of those keywords. As he is a character, he is unique, and he also has an ability, which is +2 direct influence against the Wood Elves faction. One of the big parts of this game is rallying factions. To do that you have to roll 2d6 and score higher than a target number, and often you can modify that roll, adding any of the character's unused direct influence. Legolas's ability can simply be translated as meaning a +2 modifier on his influence test for bringing the Wood Elves faction into play. Finally, in the bottom left you have prowess and defense, which are used for combat, and on the right you sometimes have a corruption modifier, which comes into play when a character makes a corruption check. Legolas doesn't have any modifier, while Boromir, who is more inclined to be seduced by shiny things, has a -1 corruption modifier. After selecting your starting characters, you place them all in Rivendell, and then you can organise them into companies. That is, you can divide them up into smaller parties and put your weaker characters under the direct influence of stronger characters. Smaller parties let you cover more ground and will generally face less hazards, but when they do face hazards they will have more difficulty surviving them. Larger parties are a magnet for trouble, but generally have more skills to deal with it. You are also allowed to choose 2 minor items and give them to characters of your choice. What you pick will often depend on the characters you have selected, but generally you want to go for things that will heal or untap characters. Next you place up to 10 characters in your play deck. Characters are all unique, which means you are only allowed to include 1 of each in your deck, with the exception of wizards. A wizard is your avatar in the game, and while you can only ever have 1 in play, you can include 2 in your deck to increase your chances of finding one early. However, part of the strategy is knowing when to bring a wizard into play. The wizards are powerful with a lot of direct influence and special abilities, but if they are ever killed you will instantly lose the game. So there's a nice little risk-reward element baked into deciding when to play one. At this point you are ready to begin play, so you draw a hand of 8 cards and off you go on your adventure in Middle-earth. Each player's turn is divided into 6 phases. First you have your untap phase. Throughout the game you will be asked to tap cards for a variety of reasons. For example, characters can tap to receive attacks in combat or to attempt to bring a card into play such as an item or faction. There are plenty of cards that let you untap cards for improved utility and efficiency, but for the most part once a card is tapped you have to wait until your next untap phase to use it again. It should however be noted, when you visit a site to bring a new card into play, more often than not the site becomes tapped, and sites do not untap in the untap phase. Sites will only ever untap at the point you exhaust your play deck, which means you may only ever get to use some sites once per game. Additionally, injured characters at a haven can heal. This changes them from wounded to tapped. In subsequent turns they will be able to untap as normal. Next is the organisation phase. In this phase you can play one character or wizard either at a haven or at the site listed on their character card. You can also reorganise your companies, combining them, splitting them, or shifting characters between general and direct influence. You are also allowed to move items between characters or store certain items at locations to bank their marshalling points or progress a more intricate scheme. And this brings into play another core mechanism: corruption checks. The characters of Middle-earth are all subject to being corrupted. The lure of nature, the lure of pretty shiny things, it all takes a toll. Any character giving up an item must make a corruption check by rolling 2d6. If the result with any modifiers is greater than their current corruption score, which starts at 0 and increases as they gather items or face hazards, then they are fine. If the score is equal to or 1 less than their corruption score, then the character and any non-follower card they control are all discarded. This represents them temporarily losing faith. You may have a chance to bring them back into play if you shuffle your discard pile into your play deck. Finally, if the character fails a corruption check by more than 1, then the character is eliminated and removed from play. If your wizard ever fails a corruption check, you lose the game. Finally, you have to decide if each of your companies will move to another site or stay where they are. If a company is going to move, you play a new site card face down, and if you are playing the advanced rules, you also play all of the region cards the company will travel through to get there. Next is the long event phase. All of your resource long events are removed, you can play any new resource long events you wish to play, and then you can remove your opponent's hazard long events. Long events can be very beneficial to you, but you have to take care, as your opponent will also benefit from them as they will remain in play until your next turn. Then you have the movement and hazard phase. In turn, each of your companies will activate. If they are moving, you reveal their destination and the regions they are moving through. If they are moving to a non-haven site, you may draw up to the number of cards specified on that site card. If you are moving to a haven site, you may draw up to the number of cards specified on the site card they are leaving. And that's a good example of how granular and fiddly the rules for this game can be. There are lots of little instances of rules like this that are quite easy to forget. They do make thematic sense, but it's going to take a fair few games before all those little nuances lock into your brain. Normally that's a degree of fiddle that I find a bit of a turn off, but here it gets a pass because the game does such a good job of modelling an adventure in Middle-earth. I can forgive a little bit of clunk and fiddliness in the right circumstances. During movement, your opponent also gets to draw cards and play hazards. In a multiplayer game, your opponent is always the player sitting to your left. An opponent can play up to 2 hazard cards or a number of hazard cards equal to the number of characters in the company. Hobbits only count as half for this purpose. So you can see that bigger companies are going to draw a lot more attention and face a lot more danger. Hazard events can usually be played on any company during the movement phase and have a range of effects such as forcing corruption checks, tapping characters or making journeys more perilous. Hazard creatures are either keyed to regions the company moves through or the final destination. For example, here is the Mouth of Sauron, which you can play as a creature or a short event. In order to use this card as a creature, the company must have a dark domain region in their site path or must be moving to, or staying at, a dark hold site. Here is another example, Tom from The Hobbit. Tom is a creature that can be keyed to wilderness regions, but you will notice he has 2 wilderness icons on his card. That means a company can only face Tom if they have at least 2 wilderness regions in their site path. And one more example, the Watcher in the Water. The Watcher can be played if there are 2 wilderness regions or 1 coastal region in the site path. Additionally, in the body text of the card, it says you can play the Watcher if the company is at Moria. Other creatures may be playable at specific regions. It's a lot to keep track of, and until you are very familiar with the cards in your deck, you will probably find there is a good deal of analysis paralysis in your plays. In addition to using hazards on the moving company, the opposing player also has a chance to place 1 card face down on guard at the company's destination. That card could be a hazard or a bluff. It counts towards the hazard limit but won't trigger in the movement phase. It's going to sit there and cause mild concern until the company explores that site later in the turn. But before we get to that, let's talk about combat. Should your opponent be able to play hazard creatures, sooner or later there's going to be a rumble, and this can really be fun. Especially if you have some good characters with good equipment and a hand of useful resource cards, because there are lots of ways to nullify attacks or improve your chances of victory. You may have a card that says you can tap a scout character to cancel a hazard creature's attack, or you may have a weapon you can tap that will increase your defense. This is often where the most interesting card play occurs, as the company uses cards to help them and the opposing player drops hazards to cause as much trouble as possible. Should a company end up having to face an attack, it's a pretty simple process to deal with. Let's look at Tom again. In the body text of his card it says he makes 1 strike. That means the defending player has to select 1 character to face the attack. Some creatures have multiple strikes. For example, the Watcher in the Water deals 1 strike to each character in the company. Some creatures also let the opposing player choose the defender. If a creature has more strikes than the number of characters in the company, additional strikes become -1 modifiers to a character's prowess. There are also other modifiers that may come into play. For example, normally a character will tap after defending a strike, but if you don't want to tap the character, you can instead take a -3 modifier to prowess. There are also modifiers for already being tapped and being wounded. Resolving a strike is simple. You roll 2d6 and add your character's prowess, taking into account any modifiers. If it's greater than the creature's prowess and the creature doesn't have a body value, like Tom here doesn't have a body value, then the strike is defeated. If all strikes are defeated, the creature is slain and the company gains the creature card for the marshalling points. If the roll is greater than the creature's prowess but that creature does have a body value, the creature makes a body check. To do this, roll 2d6. If the total is greater than the creature's body value, the strike is defeated. As before, if all strikes are defeated, the creature is slain. If a character's roll matches the creature's prowess, the attack is blocked but not defeated. It is possible to successfully block all incoming strikes without slaying the creature. Of course, if the character fails to match or exceed the prowess of the creature's strike, then the character loses and is wounded. Their card is rotated 180 degrees and they must make a body check. If they fail the body check, they are eliminated from the game. Combat can be very deadly, and even when it isn't deadly, it's often debilitating, as heroes become wounded and resources are depleted. So where possible, it's best to tread lightly unless you are well versed in the ways of war. But assuming all goes well and your brave adventurers reach their destination, you remove their site of origin from play, discarding it if it's a tapped non-haven location, otherwise returning it to your location deck, and then you discard or draw cards until you have a hand of 8. Next is the site phase, which is where you will have a chance to bag more points by bringing into play factions and items. If you have a card in your hand that is playable at your site, you can tap a member of the company to bring the card into play under that character's control. First, the company has to face any automatic attacks from the site, plus any hazard cards that the opponent placed on guard. The automatic attacks are present only in the most dangerous locations. However, if you have a hobbit on the team and you are intending to play an item, you can make a burglary test. You roll 2d6 and if you score more than 5, you tap the site and the hobbit to play the item to the hobbit. The downside is, if you fail the burglary roll, then the hobbit faces the automatic attacks alone. This is an optional rule, but I like it because it's another string in a hobbit's bow and makes them a bit more desirable in your lineup. After dealing with automatic attacks, you can try to bring a card into play. In some cases you may be able to play the card automatically, but if you are trying to rally a faction to your cause, you have to make an influence check, rolling 2d6, adding the unused direct influence for the character making the test, and then factoring in any other modifiers. For example, if Legolas is part of the company at Thranduil's Hall and you have the Wood Elves faction in your hand, you could tap Legolas to attempt to rally the Wood Elves. Legolas has a direct influence of 2, so as long as he doesn't have any characters under his control, he adds 2 to his influence check. Additionally, he has the unique ability that gives him +2 direct influence against the Wood Elves, and the Wood Elves card says that elves also get a +1 to their checks as standard, so Legolas gets +5 on this check. If he scores greater than 8, the Wood Elves ride for war. They have no impact on the game, but you can place the Wood Elves faction card in your marshalling points pile. It's worth 3 points in the points salad at the end of the game. If you do successfully play a resource in the site phase, you have the option of tapping a second character in the party to immediately play a minor item. This is a little bonus reward. Once you have finished the site phase, you can discard 1 card and then discard or draw until you have 8 cards in hand. Your opponent does the same, and then it's their turn. And this continues until the free council has been called, all but 1 wizard is dead or corrupted, or the 1 ring has been destroyed. And it's just bloody lovely. It's such a clever, intricate, tricksy sort of game. It has its faults. Obviously being collectible is a pain, but even ignoring that, it's a very difficult game to get into. There are so many different types of cards, so many ways for those cards to interact. Deck building is a challenge in its own right, and there is a steep learning curve. There are lots of rules, lots of fiddly details, lots of things I didn't even cover here because I was planning on making just one video, not a trilogy. But if you can work through those issues, if you can put together a decent card pool and commit to internalising the rule set, there is just so much here in this game for fans of Tolkien to love. And I think there's more to love than simply running through the rules can demonstrate. For a start, it's just amazing to see this much loved world realised on cards by some spectacular artists. That's one of the reasons I keep thinking about picking up Fantasy Flight Games' Lord of the Rings living card game, even though I've never thought that much of the gameplay. Admittedly, as with all card games, the quality of the Middle-earth art wavers. Sometimes you get a masterpiece from John Howe or Liz Dansworth. Sometimes you get whatever this is. But for the most part, the art is excellent, and I think it got more consistent as the expansions rolled out. There is a certain mystical, fantastic element to every piece, even the pieces that I would say aren't good. And it's just lovely to be able to walk through those worlds and engage with those characters and live those stories. There are some very good Lord of the Rings games, and I think War of the Ring is probably the one that most people would say is King of the Hill, but I'm not sure even that game so meticulously recreates Tolkien's world. I mean, this is a game where you can hang out with Tom Bombadil and his wife, and have stern words with Old Man Willow before fending off the Barrow Wights and finding a White Blade. I mentioned earlier in this video that there are ways to string cards together to recreate key moments from the books, and when you can achieve those combos, it's pretty magical. Exhibit A. Throughout the game you will find gold rings. This is a good one. It's a precious gold ring with a higher chance of being the One Ring. If you have access to Gandalf or a resource card that lets you test a gold ring, you can make a test. You roll 2d6. If you score 10 or more, you can play the One Ring from your hand. Be careful when you do this though, as the bearer of the ring, while becoming immensely powerful, also gains 6 corruption points, and everyone else in the bearer's company also gets a corruption point. But now you have the ring, you can try to destroy it. You do that by travelling to Mount Doom. Once you are there, you can play Cracks of Doom. You make a corruption check modified by -4, and if successful, the One Ring is destroyed, and you win. But the ring gives you 6 corruption points, so with the -4 modifier, that's a low chance of success for most characters. So maybe you could do this instead. Travel to Moria, pick up Gollum, watch out, he will try to steal the ring any chance he gets, then take Gollum to Mount Doom, and then play Gollum's fate. If Gollum and the One Ring are both present, you instantly win. Not an easy trick to pull off, but it shouldn't be. One more example for you. At some point you could come into possession of Narsil, a powerful item in its own right, worth 3 marshalling points and granting +1 prowess and +1 direct influence to the bearer. But Narsil is broken. We want to do something about that. So we go to a site where information is playable, and we tap a Sage character to play Reforging. Our Sage now remains tapped until we reach a haven and store Reforging. Then we go to another site where information is playable, we tap a Sage and we play Anduril. Again, our Sage remains tapped until we store Anduril at a haven. Once we have done that, we can discard a stored Reforging to play Anduril with Narsil, and now the bearer is carrying something worth 7 marshalling points, which grants +5 prowess and +2 direct influence. That's when boss music starts playing. And this game is just full of moments like that, combos that string together to recreate the narratives we know from the stories. You can fly on the eagles to reach distant locations, you can take Earth from Galadriel's garden back to Bag End, you absolutely can crown Aragorn as king and usher in a new era of men. No, you won't do all those things in any one game, but you can do some of them, and you can build whole decks around those ideas. I am currently putting together a solo challenge deck called Return of the King, which will require reforging Anduril and deposing Denethor to crown Aragorn. Oh, because I should point out, you can play this game solo. The rules for doing so are a little loosey-goosey. It's one of those situations where you're just asked to play in such a way to cause yourself as many problems as possible. But I'm fine with that. I have played games that weren't intended for solo play for years, and this one is pretty easy to run that way. But if you are playing with opponents, another interesting feature of this game is that you and your opponents are all playing in the same world. That means if one player has a unique character, no one else can play that character. If someone has already reforged Anduril, you can't do it too, it's done. This is interesting because not only does it mean there is a real race to get certain characters or factions into play, it also means there is a chance that a character can change allegiance. For example, if a character fails a corruption check and goes into your discard pile, that opens up a chance for your opponent to play that same character. They have effectively switched allegiance. It's a fun little twist that gives you something else to think about. And I could go on, but I think it's time to summarise. This is a very good game, but it's not an easy game. It's demanding. You can't just pick it up and start playing. You need to understand what the game offers and what you want to take from it, what stories you want to make. It requires effort, and it will reward that effort. I'm not sure any of my gaming circle will take to Middle-earth, but I am very happy to have it as part of my collection, and I will be building decks and playing solo games and reliving my favourite parts of this story for a very long time to come. I don't think I would say this is the best Lord of the Rings game. There's a little too much clunk and heavy lifting. I wouldn't even say it's the best Lord of the Rings game I own, as I have the Confrontation on my shelf, which is a fantastic distillation of theme into a beautifully packaged and deeply engaging experience in this world. But the Middle-earth collectible card game is a love letter to Tolkien's work, and that's not something I would say about all the games bearing his name. That counts for a heck of a lot. And that's it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider pressing the like button. If you've really enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.